Hello wrestling fans, Pro Wrestle Machine is back online with another program. Here's an interesting breakdown of the pro wrestling business in 1997. May 5, 1997 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Major business breakdown of all companies. Bret surgery. FMW draws 16,000, more. By Observer staff. Since this was a slow news week, it's probably the best chance we'll get to examine the business in the major four wrestling companies for the first quarter, January 1st through March 31st. The first quarter is, at least in the United States, the most important quarter of the year because traditionally that's when all facets of the business are usually at their high point in any given year. What these figures show, which is something that has been obvious all along, and that is that house shows, pay-per-view business and television ratings are three entirely different animals, and the feelings people have close to and inside the industry as to how business is, and how business really is, are often entirely different stories as well. As we all know, the perception seems to be of the World Wrestling Federation as being this company on a major decline, having been passed, even lapped by World Championship Wrestling, and WCW as the most powerful wrestling company on the planet. In comparing the two promotions, we see that the WWF is still ahead when it comes to house shows, although both major American companies have made tremendous strides in getting people out to the arena since the lull in wrestling's live show popularity from 1992 to 1995. It should be noted that WCW has sold out 38.6% of its shows thus far this year, while WWF is at 6.6%, which means a lot of the difference in average attendance is simply because WCW is playing in smaller capacity arenas overall, and a lot of the gate differences is because WWF charges higher ticket prices generally to its shows. WCW should close the gap this next quarter with a recent ticket price increase. Over the first 3 months of the year, the WWF is pretty much, when it comes to arena business, at a similar level as last year with no real decline at all, and way ahead of business during the same period in 1995. However, in comparison to both previous years, the cable television ratings across the board, and not just the Monday night numbers which have actually held up better than the Saturday and Sunday numbers, are in the toilet. As you can see when it comes to WWF, back in 1995 when arena business was 43% lower than it is today, television ratings were 45% higher. If you ever need any more facts to show that getting people to watch pro wrestling on television and getting people to attend live shows are two entirely different things, then keep reading because you'll get all the evidence you need. The alarming numbers from a WWF standpoint are in pay-per-view. Keep in mind that the 1995 figures are a little misleading on the surface in comparison to 1996 and 1997 because 1995 compares two shows, WrestleMania and Royal Rumble, while in both 1996 and 1997 you're throwing in a February in your house that did decidedly lower numbers. Still, comparing this year with last year, the WWF is down, and this is not in any way a misleading figure, some 34% in the pay-per-view division. The perception is that this is because WCW has taken over, and that really isn't the case either because WCW during the same period has only slightly increased its numbers from last year and is well behind the same period in 1995. That latter pated facts will probably surprise a lot of people who believe that the buy rates have gone through the roof of late due to the NWO and Nitro, when the buy rates were considerably higher before either was around. And that's throwing in some major hot-shotting this year in the form of an estimated $500,000 to Dennis Rodman and who knows how much to Roddy Piper in addition to Hulk Hogan's huge percentage which has been there for the past 3 years. How many of you knew that the TV ratings thus far this year for WCW are down as compared to the same period in 1995 and 1996. However, since the decline is 6% as compared with the WWF's decline of 29%, the perception is that WCW has increased. Of course, WCW has increased tremendously when it comes to house show business, with it hitting yet another level in January. House show business has nearly tripled in the past 2 years for WCW and is blowing away any kind of figures in the history of the company. This comes at the same time that the company's television ratings and even buy rates have declined compared to the same quarter of the past 2 years. Basically what we can gather is that more people are going to wrestling live, and although we don't have figures to back this up here, people are buying a lot more merchandise. However, fewer people are watching on television and ordering pay-per-view shows. Since the pay-per-view revenue per month is far more impressive and important than house show revenue or television advertising revenue, the only real money that companies get from television, although in WCW the perception is important because the people who foot the bills live and die by TV ratings, the buy rate numbers when it comes to bottom line dollars are far more important than the house show and television ratings numbers. For a total gross, as an example, if WWF averages 17 house shows per month at $88,000, That's about $1.5 million coming in, before taking away renting, advertising, transportation and all the other expenses of running an arena schedule. Pay-per-view, in a down period for the company, brings in $1.9 million, and that's with far less overhead. So as hot as wrestling seems, that in some ways may also be misleading. From a WCW standpoint, since they run fewer house shows, the pay-per-view revenue is even more important to them than WWF. From the All Japan standpoint, despite the perception of the company being stale and the lack of heat at the arenas compared to years past, the average attendance is actually slightly up from the past 2 years and the sellout percentage is roughly the same. But check out the television ratings. For a stale promotion that based on its traditional nature, lack of angles, lack of new faces on top, lack of heat and an absolutely horrible time slot, is drawing the best ratings of any major promotion, up 31% from the past year and a whopping 70% as compared with 2 years ago, during a period that the perception was that the promotion was hot and the arenas were filled with heat. Heat inside the building for the matches may actually be the single most overrated factor in how hot a promotion is. It's definitely the single most misleading. But that 70% increase in ratings really hasn't translated to the company taking in more money at the gate. New Japan has had a similar marked increase in television ratings, although attendance has slightly declined from last year and it's a little ahead of 1995. If you look at the sellout percentages for New Japan, you see that while arena business has declined from 1996, it's still overall quite a bit stronger than 1995 and television viewership is way up from both the previous years. In a nutshell, in the United States, television ratings are down, buy rates are down, and at the same time more people are going to live shows now than in years. In Japan, television ratings are through the roof with no logical explanation as to why, since they aren't the priority they are in the United States and the shows have largely been unchanged in format for the past 25 years as compared to the constant tinkering and hot-shotting that has actually resulted in lower ratings in the United States over the past few years. Business Live is largely stagnant, although stagnant at a healthy level. Leon White returned to the United States on April 24 after spending 10 days under house arrest in Kuwait while awaiting a hearing on charges of public aggression and public humiliation having to do with the incident on the Good Morning Kuwait television show. In addition, White faces secondary charges of disorderly conduct and public drunkenness stemming from a second incident on April 21 at the hotel he was being held at, which ended up involving 20 police officers. White, who had to promise to abide by the verdict in his trial, which is scheduled to take place in about 1 week before the Kuwait Court of Misdemeanors, at his hearing in order to get his passport returned and be allowed to leave Kuwait. The charges could result in a penalty of as much as 1 year in prison and fines. However, the WWF believes ultimately the decision in all charges will only result in a fine. After returning, the WWF attempted to use the first incident, while publicly ignoring from a television standpoint the second incident, although they did acknowledge it on their hotline, to further White's Hill Vader character. To this end, they held a press conference on April 25 in Manhattan with White, in his Vader mask and somewhat in character, saying that he wasn't going to apologize for the incident and claiming that the television show's host Bassam Al-Othman had initially agreed to drop charges for $25,000, but several hours later instead asked for a figure in excess of $400,000 from the WWF to drop charges, calling it a case of extortion. By this point the incident, which was a shooting that the charges filed against White in Kuwait are real, had been incorporated into the storyline, so whatever happened from that point has to be considered part of a pro wrestling storyline. That story about the host asking for $400,000 contradicts the initial story released from the WWF saying that the host had agreed to drop charges for $35,000, a figure that Vince McMahon was willing to pay for White's release, but that the host then disappeared. The incident received substantial media play last week in the US, but the press conference was only covered strong locally in the New York media, although the television show Extra was scheduled to do a piece on the entire incident on April 30th. The WWF's attempts to book White on Good Morning America on April 25th, a show which aired the incident from Kuwait on its April 18th show, were unsuccessful. While in the press, McMahon and Titan expressed sympathies toward White's situation, claiming his actions were because a producer of the show told him to ham it up, but apparently never told the host. Mark Calloway, Undertaker, was in the studio just a few feet away while the incident took place and never appeared to be alarmed by it and never even got up or attempted to calm White down. On television they portrayed it as an angle and he as a heel who had embarrassed the company by his behavior. White was given the weekend off WWF house shows since he hadn't been home to see his family in weeks, and returned on the April 28th Raw taping in Omaha, Nebraska. On that show, they teased a reprise of the angle with Jim Ross, acknowledging the "Is wrestling fake?" question, saying that every wrestler has been asked that question a million times and he should have known better than to do what he did. Vader knocked off Ross' cowboy hat and grabbed his glasses and grabbed him by the throat and teased that he was going to attack him when Ken Shamrock did a run-in and gave Vader a belly-to-belly suplex and Vader fled the scene. Bret Hart underwent arthroscopic knee surgery on April 23 at Peter Lougheed Hospital in Calgary, but his planned surgery to repair his arthritic wrist initially scheduled for April 24 didn't take place. Hart was told that should he have the operation to repair a chronic painful wrist injury, which stemmed from a break several years ago that never healed properly and he had bone fragments that needed to be cleaned up, that he would be out of action for a minimum of 3 months and that the wrist would be more susceptible to a future break. Because of both factors, Hart decided against the surgery until after he retires as a full-time wrestler. In the initial estimates of when Hart would return, it was largely based on healing from the wrist surgery, which figured to have a longer healing time than the knee operation. Because of that, Hart will almost surely be back in the ring for the June 8 King of the Ring pay-per-view from Providence, Rhode Island, where the current plan is now for him to face Shawn Michaels, who will also return at the show, in their long-awaited singles rematch. The initial plan for Hart to win the IC title from Rocky Maivia at King of the Ring was changed since Maivia dropped the belt on the April 28 Raw show to Owen Hart instead. Bret Hart appeared doing several segments in a wheelchair on the April 28 Raw show, continuing his angle with Steve Austin, which included the return of Jim Neidhart as the newest member of the Hart Foundation. Neidhart may have been brought in as an emergency sub since the Hart Foundation is booked in several six-man tag matches, many of which are main events on house shows in May. Brian Pillman was scheduled in these matches to team with Owen Hart and Davey Boy Smith, replacing the originally scheduled Bret Hart, but there is no guarantee Pillman will be ready, as he was in tremendous pain much of the week due to him putting a significant amount of pressure for the first time on his fused and reconstructed ankle from doing the angle on the April 21 Raw. Frontier Martial Arts and Wrestling ran its annual anniversary show, which by tradition is its biggest show of the year, before an announced sellout crowd of 16,000 on April 29 at the Yokohama Arena. Although it was probably a trios match with Atsushi Onita and Terry Funk on opposite sides that was the main drawing card, FMW used a women's no-rope two-sided barbed wire electronic dynamite barricade double hell death match for its two women's championships and the retirement of its longtime women's poster woman, Megumi Kudo, as the main event. Perhaps the most noteworthy news from the show was the announcement by Onita that FMW is going to book Kawasaki Baseball Stadium, 52,000 capacity, which is currently under renovation, the site of FMW's biggest shows in its history, for a show on September 28, and he's looking to make it a joint show with the World Wrestling Federation, and also looking to include wrestlers from several other Japanese offices. Onita will be meeting with Vince McMahon on May 1 to discuss a talent cooperation agreement and working together on this show. Kudo, 27, had what was billed as her final match of a nearly 11-year career that began with the All Japan Women's promotion and saw her involved in the same training camp as such luminaries as Asia Kong and Bison Kimura. Kudo captured both the WWA Women's Championship and the World Independent Women's Championships that she had recently lost to Shark Tsuchiya, Eriko Tsuchiya, in 21:46. Kudo was twice whipped into the explosive barbed wire and blown up with the mini-bombs. She also took a bump onto the explosive barbed wire barricades on the open side of the ring for an even louder explosion. Tsuchiya pulled out a knife and carved up Kudo's face. Kudo made the comeback and Tsuchiya was blown up and finally pinned for the big career finale. In the other key match, Onita and Masato Tanaka and Wing Kanemura, Yukihiro Kanemura, beat Funk and the Gladiator, Mike Alfonso, and Cactus Jack, which explains the Mankind suspension from Raw because of the booking here at the same time, in a Texas Tornado Street Fight deathmatch in 2020 when Kanemura pinned Gladiator after coming off the top rope with a chair onto his head. Funk both threw a fireball at Onita and burned him with a flaming branding iron. Funk, Onita, Tanaka and Kanemura all heavily juiced. Funk and Onita brawled into the crowd with tables and chairs, including Onita giving Funk a piledriver on a table. Since Kanemura got the pin, he then challenged Onita to a singles match which may be the big show headliner. And other results from the opener. 1. Riki Fuji, Masanori Muramatsu, and Ricky Morton beat Hideo Takayama, and Dragon Winger Toryu, when Fuji pinned Winger after a power bomb in 11:03. 2. Flying Kid Ichihara Akihito Ichihara, and Crypt Keeper, Jose Estrada Jr. beat Tetsuhiro Kuroda and Hayato Nanjo in 11:11, when Ichihara pinned Hayato. 3. Koji Nakagawa pinned Katsutoshi Niyama with an exploder suplex in 10:51. 4. Kaori Nakayama and Michiko Omukai, of the LLPW promotion, and Chikako Shiratori, of the JD promotion, real name Chikako Hasegawa, and Mizuki Endo LPW, and Yoko Ikeda beat Linus Ashika, JD, real name Tomoko Kitamura, and Eagle Sawai, Tomoko Sawai, and Crusher Maedamari, Yoshika Maedamari, and Michiko Nagashima, LPW, and Miss Mongol, Aki Kanbayashi in 1303 when Nakayama pinned Mongol after a Frankensteiner. 5. Jinsei Shinzaki, Kensuke Shinzaki, Michinoku Pro Wrestling, beat Super Leather, Mike Kirchner, in 10:29 by submission with a camel clutch. 6. In a six-man street fight match, Hiromichi Fuyuki and Gedo, Kiri Takayama, and Jado, Shoji Akiyoshi, beat Hisakatsu Oya, Kenichi Oya, and the Headhunters, Victor and Manuel Santiago, when Gedo pinned Headhunter A after a moonsault in 12:30. There are now 3 different groups within this promotion called FMW, and a 4th elsewhere as Tarzan Goto is starting up his own promotion and calling it Shin FMW. Besides the babyface FMW and the heel NWO type group called Funk Masters of Wrestling, Funk Quiñones, Gladiator, Headhunters, Oya Leather, Mr. Genosuke, Niyama, Ichihara and Crypt Keeper, the Fuyuki and Gedo and Jado Championship Trio is called FMW Fuyuki Macho Body of Wrestling. 7. In a Mascara Contra Cabellera, Mask vs. Hair, match Hayabusa Eiji pinned Mr. Genosuke in 13:22 in a match with much outside interference from Genosuke's manager Victor Quiñones. Quiñones gave Genosuke a piece of wood which he used to cut up Hayabusa's stomach. However, after the match, Hayabusa, who had said in a newspaper interview 2 days earlier that if he won he didn't want to cut Genosuke's hair but instead have him leave Quiñones' Hill FMW group, another NWO angle headed by Terry Funk, and join the Japanese babyface FMW group. When Hayabusa asked Genosuke to join the face group, Genosuke threw a fireball in his face and then took off Hayabusa's mask. Shinzaki did a run-in helping Hayabusa, so they are building to a match with Shinzaki and Hayabusa forming a tag team. Yuki Kondo, 21, having only been a pro wrestler for 15 months, became the youngest ever King of Pancrase Championship on April 27 at Tokyo Bay NK Hall for Masakatsu Funaki before an announced sellout crowd of 7,000. Funaki dominated the early portion of the match, continually going for ankle submissions. He scored 1 point when Kondo had to go to the ropes to escape an ankle lock. As the match progressed, it was the younger Kondo who started to dominate and on their feet damaged Funaki with palm blows that began to take the steam out of him. The result would have to be considered a fairly big surprise, although every Pancrase show has surprise results, but Kondo finally won the match using a cross armbreaker submission in 15:12. Kondo, considered Funaki's top protege, began his career on January 28, 1996 on the show that was taped as the first Pancrase pay-per-view show in the United States. He placed second to the Giant in the Observer's 1996 Rookie of the Year balloting. His star really began shining in September when he knocked out Frank Shamrock in what turned out to be the final Pancrase pay-per-view show and in what was generally considered, along with the Funaki vs. Boss Rutan match on the same show, as one of the 2 best Pancrase matches of 1996, this coming on the heels of his gaining what was at the time a surprise victory over Minoru Suzuki. At that point he was undefeated in Pancrase rings, but then suffered his first loss via decision to Jason DeLucia. After losing in less than 2 minutes to a choke in the King of Pancrase tournament first round to Funaki in November, he earned the title shot at Funaki with a win on points over Guy Mesger on February 22 at NK Hall. The NK Hall show, said to be the best Pancrase show since the September card in the same building, also featured the Pancrase debuts of 2 named performers from other worlds. Paul Varlins, the 6'8", 350-pound polar bear of UFC infamy, became the largest man ever to step into the Pancrase rings, but he lost by a 4-1 lost point score to Ryushi Yanagisawa after the 2 went to the 15 minutes time limit. Varlins actually got Yanagisawa in a shoulder lock to where he got a rope break, however Yanagisawa scored 4 points with 2 knockdowns of Varlins and forcing Varlins into 2 rope breaks due to ankle locks. Varlins was able to use his size early to dominate positioning on the ground, and surprising to many, did not look out of his league. However, because of his size, as the match wore on, he got tired and was said to be totally exhausted, with a bloody nose, by the finish. The other, perhaps the shortest man ever to work a Pancrase match, was noted pro wrestler Taka Michinoku, just 2 weeks removed from appearing on the ECW pay-per-view show. This was a unique match politically because it was the first time a champion from a traditional pro wrestling organization in Japan risked his reputation at what most likely was a shoot match. Michinoku holds the independent junior title recognized by both FMW and Michinoku Pro Wrestling. He trimmed down to an announced 180 pounds, which sounds inflated to me, but was unable to take his opponent Pancrase rookie Keiichiro Yamamiya down once during the match, was caught twice in submission holds and had to escape going to the ropes before finally tapping out in 7:36 to an armlock. Rutten, the former champion, despite fighting with hand and rib injuries, scored a 1-0 win via lost points over Kyuma Kunyoku. Rutten got a choke which Kunyoku escaped to the ropes, but aside from that the match was said to have been even. After the match, Rutten said that he was injured in his match last month, and this month due to the rib injury, he was unable to train hard for this match and admitted he's far from peak condition. In the other big surprise on the show, Sami Shibuya, 20, coming off a draw last month with Rutten, which was a judge's gift to Rutten due to reputation, as Shibuya clearly dominated most of the match but neither scored any points, and Shibuya showed a unique example of either a type of sportsmanship you never see in combat sports or a form of working, as when Rutten injured his ribs during that match. Rutten told Shibuya, who then stayed away from the injury rather than work the injury, lost to an ankle-lock submission from Holland's Leon Dyke. Yoshiki Takahashi beat Satoshi Hasegawa in what was said to have been among the most brutal matches in Pancrase history, overwhelming him with palm blows to the face before the match was stopped in 6:20 after 3 knockdowns. Pancrase is a strange combination of both working and shooting that is hard to actually comprehend. Unlike its rival rings, which is predominantly working matches with an occasional shoot, Pancrase is largely a unique shoot sport but with a mentality that appears to place a higher priority on a Japanese brand of honor ahead of actually winning and losing, with occasional works, mainly done for political reasons. Tommy Rich and Doug. Tommy spent a night in prison on April 20th after being arrested on charges of taking money under false pretenses and possession of less than 15 grams of marijuana. Rich, real name Thomas Richardson, 40, and Gilbert, 28, were released the next afternoon after pleading guilty to misdemeanor charges of taking money under false pretenses, and each were fined along with being ordered to return the $500 cash they received the previous night for headlining a show that they apparently walked out on. The two were scheduled to headline against each other on a River City wrestling show in Sisterville, West Virginia. According to Sisterville Police Chief Robert Haught, Rich and Gilbert, seeing the crowd was about 100 fans and with each promised $250 to make the shot, asked to be paid up front. The two then drove off with the money and were stopped near St. Mary's, West Virginia, where the two were found with a small amount of marijuana. The two were held on $2,000 bond at the Tyler County Jail, and since they were unable to post bond, they spent one night in jail. Rich worked this past weekend for ECW as a manager at their 2 shows in Massachusetts. His status with the company wasn't affected by this incident. In the latest chapter of How Come Things Like This Only Happen in Wrestling and Never in Sports Like Baseball or Basketball, on the April 25th Howard Stern radio show, a caller called up from New Jersey claiming to be an independent area pro wrestler and that he fantasized about being a serial killer and bragged about, among other things, past beatings of prostitutes by either punching them out and pounding on them with body shots with a baseball bat and leaving them writhing in agony. Stern and his crew took the caller seriously, as if it wasn't a prank, as Stern began pumping him for information which would establish his identity to alert the police. Whether it was a publicity stunt or not, the guy was convincing as a pro wrestler in that his claims of being an indie worker were both specific enough and not extravagant enough that only a major wrestling fan would have been able to pull it off. For example, he claimed his biggest match of his career would have been against Jason Knight before Knight broke his leg, an injury that would hardly be common knowledge to an average wrestling fan looking to do a prank, and mentioned Knight as a former ECW champion, a plug, given the nature of the call. That ECW in its current political situation must have loved being associated with, and I'm saying that with the utmost sarcasm. He said his next big match was a tag team match against a team called NC-17 in a Fans Bring the Weapons match. He also said he worked as a mail clerk but not for the post office and claimed to be friends with Cactus Jack, who he referred to as Mike, and said that they had met when he was hanging around the hotels in Philadelphia. Stern felt he'd gotten enough information on the wrestling to establish who the guy was and begged him to hold off not killing anyone at least through the weekend. It was a really creepy situation, and considering Stern's listenership nationwide, became a pretty big topic of conversation that day around the wrestling world. Japanese television rundown. April 13th. All Japan. 1. Stan Hansen pinned Johnny Ace in 1408 with a lariat. The last 8 minutes aired on television. Ace carried the body of the match and both were stiff enough in their offensive moves that it was watchable. Hansen, as is par in a singles match nowadays, was just hanging on. Ace got several near falls including hitting his ace crusher, and Hansen won with a lariat almost out of nowhere. The last few minutes weren't bad. 2 stars. 2. Akira Tao pinned Gary Albright after a foot to the face in 8:48. The offense was stiff on both sides but it was anything but smooth and the match didn't have any heat. Tao blocked Albright's killer suplexes and twice hit choke slams, but Albright didn't even get off his feet to make the move look good. 3/4 of a star. 3. Hansen drew Jun Akiyama over 30 minutes. Only the final 2:15 aired. You really couldn't tell anything about match quality by what aired. 4. Toshiaki Kawada beat Albright with an armbreaker in 7:27. They aired an early clip of the match which looked great with them trading hard kicks and Albright doing his suplexes which had great heat, but then they jumped cut to the finish and the crowd was dead. So it probably wasn't that great of a match. 5. Steve Williams pinned Mitsuharu Misawa with a backdrop driver in 18:21. Only the final 2 minutes aired and it appeared to be a good match. Williams dropped him right on his head for the pin. April 20th. All Japan. 1. Misawa drew Kobashi over 30 minutes. The final 15:30 of the match aired on television. I'm not sure if these matches should be rated as 3 singles matches or as 1 triangle match. If it's rated as 1 triangle match, even not having seen the Kobashi Kawada match, which aired on April 27th, I'd bet it would have to be called Match of the Year. Individually, this first match of the 3 was close to that level. For every wrestler or fan, particularly those who watch wrestling with their ears shut and eyes closed, who has had it drummed into their heads that off said, and sometimes true, but it goes for American and Mexican wrestling as well about being sometimes true, saying about Japanese wrestling having no psychology, they need to get a tape of these 2 matches. From a psychology standpoint, it was a masterpiece. Every move they did meant something. Every move was sold the right way. Every move was hit perfectly. Every move built the match, and they filled the match using 90s moves that were over to the modern crowd. They didn't miss moves. They didn't do moves that they had no business doing because they aren't proficient in doing them. It was the 70s psychology but faster paced than a 30 minutes match would have been in those days, although slower paced than most shorter main events nowadays because they spent so much more time selling moves and using the 90s athleticism and stiffness. Still, this wasn't as good as their January title switch match in Osaka. I just this weekend saw the unedited 42 minutes version of that match and it was no worse, with Austin vs. Hart for Mania, than the second best match thus far in 1997. Anyway, this match was already hot when the television picked it up. Kobashi dropped Misawa on his head and got a great near fall with a half Nelson into a German suplex. After a rabbit lariat called Enzu lariat, Kobashi hit 2 power bombs and used a jackknife pin but Misawa kicked out. Misawa began working over Kobashi's lariat arm when he elbowed Kobashi's bicep. Misawa hit 2 tiger suplexes for near falls, followed by a tiger driver. Misawa came off the top rope but Kobashi caught him by the throat and put him down. Misawa used a somersault kick and tiger driver but again Kobashi kicked out. Kobashi came back and used his new crush bomb, which starts as a vertical suplex turned into a power bomb bump just as time ran out. This was an excellent match standing alone, and almost an unbelievable match considering that both men still had another match left. 4.5 stars. 2. Kawada pinned Misawa in 6:09. This started out as their typical war with scary stiff blows, trading the kicks and the forearms mainly. Since Misawa was tired from the previous match, Kawada was the stronger and dominated but Misawa had his comebacks. Finally Kawada took over using a stretch plum which both guys sold like it really meant something. Finish saw Misawa kick out of a power bomb, and Kawada put the stretch plum on to further soften him. He gave a second power bomb and again Misawa kicked out. He softened him up with another stretch plum and hit a third power bomb held with a folding press and Misawa was pinned for the first time ever by Kawada in a singles match. Considering they had to do a short match for booking purposes and that Misawa had just come from doing a 30 minutes match where he sold big and had to sell exhaustion, thus limiting what would make sense for him to do, this match couldn't have been any better. 3 stars 3/4. Puerto Rico. The big angle involves a tease of a heel turn of Pablo Marquez. Marquez has been given a major push of late as the protege of Invader #1. On April 13th in Cabo Rojo, he beat Skull Von Crush in a loser leaves town match. Marquez, who has been working in prelims largely over the lightweight title, was moved up to main events over this past weekend teaming with Invader and also with Carlos Colon against teams that included heel manager Rico Suave, Julio Estrada. However, on television, Hill Chicky Star invited Marquez out and said that Invader hasn't been teaching him well and asked Victor the Butler to give Marquez a gift, which was supposedly a roll of $100 bills. Marquez took the money and left. New to the area is Justin St. John, who most recently worked for Bert Prentice's North American promotion in Nashville. Several shows of late have been headlined by Invader vs. Star in a nails match. Bushwhackers have already left. EMLO for the time being. They've moved the Friday night shows from Arena Mexico to Arena Coliseo in Mexico City, which usually means somewhat toned down shows and not having any foreigners around, so the crew that was here, including heavyweight champ The Steel, Black Magic, Kevin Quinn, Foreign Exchange, and the rest are all gone. The major angle on April 25th was a babyface turn by Felino in the main event. Felino came off the win in the elimination match last week, where he was left with four faces: La Fiera, Atlantis, Mascara Magica, and Ultimo Dragon, and pinned them all in succession to win the match. After the match, Felino cried in a babyface fashion as he was presented with the trophy. The April 25th main event consisted of Felino and Black Warrior and Scorpio Jr. against Negro Casas and Ultimo Dragon and La Fiera. Casas and Felino, who are brothers in real life, which isn't a secret although they do a brother rivalry type deal, worked scientifically against one another. This led to Scorpio and Warrior turning on Felino, and they destroyed him. Finally, Casas came to the aid of his brother. This led to Scorpio and Warrior walking to the back and coming back with Leo del Santo, who worked heel for the first time outside of Arena Mexico. Santo said he had no problem with Dragon and Fiera, but was there to fight Casas and Felino. The crowd was totally behind Casas and Felino, and against Santo in the angle. Mano Negra is now sans hair after losing a hair versus hair match to Brazo de Plata on April 15th at Arena Coliseo. Bestia Salvaje blew out his knee and will be out of action for a few weeks. Promo Azteca. The April 25th show in Xochimilco, headlined by Mascara Sagrada vs. Cien Caras in a singles match, in Conan and La Parca and Angel Azteca vs. Mascara Año 2000 and Universo 2000, and Zapatista drew a sellout 2,700. At the show, they had a fan balloting asking fans what wrestlers they'd like from the other promotions to see join Azteca, with the idea that they'd make a big play for them. From AAA, Octagon was the highest vote getter, and from EMLL, it was Santo. The weekend television, taped April 18th in Mexico City, was confusing again. They opened with a match with Nigma and Shu El Guerrero and Black Dragon vs. Hitano and Skyd and Kato Kung Lee, airing the first two falls, which were split, but never airing the third fall. Then they aired Villanos 3 and 5 and Blue Panther beating Fantasma and El Brazo and Tarzan Boy all three falls, but the match itself was heavily edited. Finally, they aired the main event with Los Hermanos Dinamita vs. Zorro and Sagrada and Lismark Jr. However, once again television time ran out in the middle of the third fall, so there was no conclusion aired. Conan starts booking the television shows starting with the May 2nd card. Among the changes to expect include brief segments airing wrestlers from WCW to introduce them to the Mexican fans so that they can be brought into Mexico and mean something immediately. Expect these feuds to be pushed starting this coming month: Conan and Parca and Lismark Jr. vs. Psicosis and Pantera del Ring and Black Warrior, who hasn't started yet here and still worked this past weekend for EMLL. Villanos vs. Dynamitas, Supercolo vs. Juventud Guerrera and Angel Azteca, and Super Electra vs. Halloween and Damien. AAA. On the television this weekend, they announced that there will now be 3 Triple Manias instead of 1 as was the previous plan. They announced the first one on May 30th in Tijuana. No arena announced, with Los Payasos vs. Super Muñeco and Mascara Sagrada Jr. and La Parca Jr., with the loser of the deciding full unmasking, most likely Payaso Coco Rojo, who is Cobarde. They announced the second one for June 1st at Juan de la Barrera Gym in Mexico City. They said the date and location for the third hasn't been decided. Announced as appearing for the Triple Manias were Razor Ramon, Diesel, Jake Roberts, Mankind, Vader, Goldust, and Marlena and Bret Hart. The first 3 are all likely to appear, but the latter 5 will almost certainly not appear, at least on the first 2 shows, since they are all booked for WWF house shows in San Jose and Cleveland on the same night, except for Bret, who will likely still be out of action at that time. They are running a major television taping on April 30th in Veracruz with Cibernetico and Kinect and Latin Lover vs. Ramon and Diesel and Roberts, Pentagon defending the Mexican middleweight title against Octagon and Sagrada Jr., and Heavy Metal and Hector Garza, and Parca Jr. vs. Picudo, and My Flowers and Crazy 33 and Jerry Estrada. Blue Demon Jr. has changed his costume from the replica of his famous father to a more futuristic Psicosis/Venom type of costume, as if there weren't enough wrestlers dressed like that in AAA already, but in blue. The idea is that Batman and Superman have changed to more futuristic costumes in the US, so it's time for a more futuristic Blue Demon in Mexico. Pero Aguayo is now campaigning for the job of city commissioner in his hometown on Tola, Jalisco near Guadalajara. The election is in June. His son is out of action with a serious groin injury. Tinieblas Jr. will return in a few weeks, after being out with a serious injury. Hector Garza has been unhappy of late. He jumped from EMLL to AAA largely because he was promised it would lead to him getting a WWF contract, and now that it hasn't materialized, he's looking for another way out. New Japan. The biggest angle is actually recognizing the WCW angle of a few months back with Masahiro Chono signing with the NWO. Chono went on a lengthy family vacation to the United States but was at the Nitro show backstage on April 21st and at that point sent word that he had signed with NWO instead of New Japan and was given the title of the NWO Asia Japan Business Manager. He said he would be staying in the United States for the next 3 months and that Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Hiro Saito would also be signing with NWO instead of New Japan. Expect a lot more in regard to this angle this coming week since Eric Bischoff will be attending the May 3rd Osaka Dome show, and the Keiji Muto angle will end up playing itself out with Muto, at least as of the current plans, joining NWO sometime next month. New Japan ran house shows all week but with so many of the big names absent, there is nothing of major news. Naoya Ogawa suffered a knee injury in training doing a mountain climbing drill but will be wrestling on the May 3rd show. Apparently Shinya Hashimoto did an incredible interview on the April 19th television show, actually taped after losing the match at the Tokyo Dome on April 12th, building up the title match with Ogawa. Ogawa will start wrestling full-time with New Japan on the May tour. April 19th TV show did a 2.0 rating while the April 20th All Japan show did a 3.7. Other Japan notes. Still don't have a lot of details on the April 22nd Rings show in Osaka before 4,870 fans with full Hanover Akira Maeda in the main event. The other top matches saw Kiyoshi Tamura beat Tsuyoshi Kosaka. Those are the two best Japanese workers in the company, so it was likely an awesome match. In 1357 and Yoshihisa Yamamoto beat Masayuki Naruse in 2120, which also may have been a very good match. Tony Halme, Ludwig Borga, who is in the next UFC, was brought back and lost to Dick Frey in about 2 minutes when the doctor stopped the match. Terry Funk returned to Japan with FMW and was on tour starting April 25th. Haito and Wing Kanemura captured FMW's World Brass Knucks Tag Team titles from the Headhunters on the April 25th Osaka show. Tarzan Goto, who has been working independently of late for War, and protege Ryo Miyake, will be starting their own promotion called the Real Japanese FMW with the first show on June 17th in Kawasaki. Goto will be the president and his wife Despina, former American woman wrestler Despina Monteus, will be vice president. Solar, EMLL, Superboy, Los Angeles local wrestler, and Bobby Blaze, former SMW wrestler, are currently on tour with Michinoku Pro. Daisuke Iketo of Battle Arts will be working full-time for All Japan on the next tour from May 17th to June 6th. This will be the first time Baba has brought in a wrestler from another promotion in years to work as a full-timer on a tour. Of late, he's brought in guys like Yoshiaki Fujiwara, Hayabusa and Yuhi Sano to work mid-card in major shows. Ikeda's childhood hero growing up was Baba, and he's going to team with Baba and work comedy matches throughout the tour. USWA Larry Burton left for California but should be returning shortly and is still general manager of the company. Jerry Lawler regained the unified title from King Reginald on April 27th in Memphis. The Truth Commission regained the USWA Tag Team titles from the Shooting Stars, Troy Haste and Jerry Faith, sometime over the past week. The latter pair, who were booked to win the tag titles by Mike Samples, are already down to jobber status with Dutch Mantle handling the booking. Mantle also turned heel along with Bill Dundee. It stemmed from Mantle being replaced as a television announcer by Michael St. John, who is now Lance Russell's full-time co-host. Mantle brought out all the babyfaces asking them who would be a better announcer, and the only one who sided with him was Dundee. Dundee and Mantle have been saying in their interviews that the current wrestlers don't respect the icons of the business. Of course that begets the question, whether they do or don't, what does that have to do with Dundee, Mantle and anyone else in the USWA? They're being joined by newcomer Ox Brody, Lenny Keene, who has been among other people Moondog Cujo and Cousin Jr. in the past, who is a masked man doing a gimmick about how mad he is that pro wrestling has changed from the way he likes it. Another newcomer is Paul Diamond, Tom Borick, the former Kato of WWF fame and pro soccer goalkeeper in another lifetime, who in his interview said he's been out of wrestling for 2.5 years. Diamond and Stephen Dunn are being programmed as the challengers for the Truth Commission's belts. They did an angle with Billy Travis and Flash Flanagan. Travis apologized to Flanagan for turning on him. Travis gave Flanagan his guitar and turned his back and told Flanagan he could hit him with it if it would make him happy. Flanagan refused to hit him with the guitar and left. Naturally, as he walked off, Travis hit him from behind with the guitar. The lineup for the April 29th Memphis show was Samples vs. Bobby Bolton, Flanagan vs. Travis, Truth Commission defending against Mabel and Spellbinder, Mantle and Dundee versus Diamond and Dunn. Christopher defending USWA title against Brody and Fine defending the unified title against Jerry Lawler, and if Lawler lost, which he didn't, he had to be Queen Nikki's servant for one day. Here and there. This has nothing to do with pro wrestling, but it's something that would probably be of interest to many longtime wrestling fans. This past week the CBS affiliate in San Francisco ran a lengthy piece about Joan Weston, a roller derby superstar in the 60s and early 70s, and who is dying from Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. The disease, which attacks the brain, is so rare that this is the first case of its type diagnosed in California. Weston, 62, was arguably the most popular female athlete in the United States in her era as the top female babyface of roller derby with the San Francisco Bay Bombers. The piece was really sad, to the point that many people in this area who were fans of hers said they couldn't even bear to watch it. Weston has lived in Hayward, California since the original roller derby folded in late 1973. She was bedridden, literally unable to speak, and barely reacted to the reporters and camera people that were there doing the story. She looked to be about 100 years old and to weigh about 100 pounds, and her husband, who was a top heel in the same world named Nick Scopus, was broken up. She skated a derby reunion game at the Cow Palace in San Francisco last winter and apparently forgot some of her trademark spots, and some skaters noticed it, and that was apparently the beginning of the problem, as shortly after that she dropped 60 pounds quickly and was diagnosed with the disease, which is similar to the mad cow disease in England. Roller derby was a popular work sport in the 60s through the early 70s, which had tremendous crossover appeal to pro wrestling fans in those days, and Weston was its top female star. Frank Defford, who wrote a book about roller derby, called Weston probably as good a female athlete as I've ever seen. A correction regarding the notes last week regarding the death of area wrestler Mitsu Arakawa. It was incorrect to state that the first Roy Shire show at the Cow Palace that drew 16,000 fans in 1960 was the biggest crowd ever in the building that didn't involve Ray Stevens. Apparently some area people's memories of events 37 years ago aren't perfect, including Shire himself, who passed away several years ago. That first card had 3 equally billed main events: Arakawa versus Bill Melby, Argentina Rocca versus Don Leo Jonathan, and Stevens versus Cowboy Bob Ellis. Stevens, Arakawa and Melby were the ones on television every week promoting the show, while the other 3 were more international superstars of the era. Shire used to remember the build-up for the first card, which put him on the map as a promoter because of his angle to have Arakawa destroy everyone week after week on television on a live Friday night primetime show on KTVU in Oakland, with the stomach claw. He then brought in Melby, a bodybuilder with the abs, who did a run-in with Arakawa, and Arakawa put the claw in his stomach. He flexed the abs, and the claw didn't work, and Arakawa sold it huge to set up their singles match at the Cow Palace. Melby was actually brought out of retirement for the angle since Shire, as a new promoter, was having a hard time getting talent for his shows because the NWA considered him as an outlaw promoter at the beginning, since the NWA branch in San Francisco was run by Joe Malsieux. However, Stevens did headline that show against Ellis. According to Rita Renwick Thompson, that night put Stevens on the map nationally as a top singles star. There was quite a list of names appearing on the Muse show on April 27th in Baltimore, including Raven, Stevie Richards, Blue Meanie, Disco Inferno, Salvatore Sincere, Buddy Landell, Chris Condito, Scott Putski, Balls Mahoney, Missy Hyatt, the Pit Bulls, Devin Storm, Samoan Gangstas, and the Headbangers. They were building up to a cage match for the MUF title, with Disco defending against Richards for early June. National Championship Wrestling on May 17th in Red Lion, Pennsylvania has Disco, Landell, Dan Severn and Hyatt appearing. Empire Wrestling Federation on May 4th in San Bernardino, California at Boys and Girls Club has Irish Assassin versus Ludwig Borga, Tony Halme, on top. There will be a Shoots Wrestling show on June 14th at the Northeast Recreational Complex in Winter Haven, Florida. This group has added some interesting twists to the rules, which ban spitting, biting, hacking the eyes, foul language, fishhooking, or striking with the fists, feet, knee or elbows, and no headbutts or groin strikes. Matches all have a 10 minutes time limit, and matches end with a submission, ref stop, doctor stop, or throwing in the towel. Where they've added a new twist is establishing a point system. 1 point for a takedown, a throw or reversal, and for keeping the opponent under control for more than 10 seconds. Another 0.5 will be given for holding a mount position for an additional 30 seconds. A 0.5 will be given for holding a guard position for 30 seconds, and another 0.5 will be given for the contestant at the end of the fight who is the most aggressive. NHB. Ricardo Moraes, the 6'9", 265-pound Brazilian who won the second Russian Absolute UFC Rules tournament and also destroyed Yoshihisa Yamamoto of Rings in 40 seconds in a shoot match last year in Japan, will be the replacement for injured David Beneteau in the next UFC heavyweight tournament. Moraes, Carlos Barreto and Hugo Duarte had been considered for the spot, but Barreto wasn't 100% due to a foot injury and Duarte felt he needed more preparation time than he'd be given considering this just came up. The heavyweight bracketing hasn't been decided, but it'll almost certainly be bracketed to where Moraes and Tony Halme will be put in different brackets for a potential meeting in the championship match, with the winner likely getting a shot at Mark Coleman in July or September. UFC has officially announced that the show will be from Augusta, Georgia at the Richmond County Civic Center, although there isn't much publicity out on that of yet, with about 1 month before the show. There was originally supposed to be a press conference in Japan this past week regarding the July show, but the deal wasn't completed and it's not a definite the July show will be from Japan. The most likely bracketing for the lightweight tournament at the next UFC will be Christoph Leninger versus Guy Mesger and Enson Inoue versus Royce Alger, although that also is yet to be official. The Friends script for May 8th is something along the lines that Monica's, Courtney Cox, rich boyfriend for some reason wants to prove he's tough, so he ends up buying UFC so he can get in the octagon with Tank Abbott. MTV ran a UFC feature on April 28. A minor NHB show scheduled for May 17 in Columbus, Georgia is in jeopardy because of cancellation of Dan Kenny's show in Memphis, Tennessee for failure to obtain the required license from the Tennessee Boxing Commission. Columbus, Georgia Mayor Bobby Peters wasn't going to allow an NHB show in his city until city officials witnessed the Memphis event to see that the event was safe. Scott Groff, who fought in a Vale Tudo event in Japan, is promoting a show on May 29 in the Bahamas on the beach behind the Cocktails and Dreams restaurant in Western Esplanade, near Nassau. ECW Raven, Scott Levy, officially informed Paul Heyman on April 23 that he was accepting a 3-year contract at $225,000 per year from WCW. The belief is that because of the money figures and because he was welcomed into the company by Diamond Dallas Page, Eric Bischoff, and Kevin Nash, that he'll politically be protected and not used in the manner that a lot of the talented wrestlers are used, basically as television cannon fodder to get over the protected group. WCW wanted him to start on the July pay-per-view show in Daytona Beach, but his ECW contract prohibits him from appearing on a rival pay-per-view until October 13. Heyman is attempting to work out a deal with Bischoff where ECW would get some compensation from WCW for using the Extreme Team in Philadelphia, using Kimona's name in Philadelphia, and to let Raven out of his contract ahead of time. On the other hand, at this point it appears the whole Rob Van Dam deal has turned into a total angle. Van Dam was at one point talked about by WCW officials as being close to a done deal, but nothing more has been done about it. My feeling is that the initial "you sold out" reaction was so strong to Van Dam when he was negotiating that it turned into an angle to help add to his heat. Van Dam's new gimmick, being the guy who wants to work Mondays for the rival promotion, has boosted him to being one of the most over heels in the group. Officially he's only agreed to stay in ECW through the middle of June, however he has yet to give notice to All Japan, and if he was going to WCW in late June, one would think he would have done so already. Heyman said that Van Dam can do the role that he had first thought would go to Jerry Lawler as being the anti-ECW outsider, and this way he doesn't have to deal with Lawler. It would make sense for Van Dam to appear on Raw once to get his Monday night gimmick over. The strong feeling from within the wrestling industry is that the real numbers for the pay-per-view are significantly lower than what has been bandied about publicly. You can't get actual true figures for about 60 days, but a lot of people who are in the industry that have charted the show are skeptical of the figures bandied about. A correction from the ECW pay-per-view report. Van Dam did use the dreaded F word on the pay-per-view in the interview after Sabu and Van Dam beat up Taz, although it was done so quickly you would hardly have noticed it if you weren't listening for it. House shows this weekend were April 25th in Waltham, Massachusetts before 400 fans and April 26th in Revere, Massachusetts before 900 fans. On the first night, they did an angle after Van Dam beat Spike Dudley. Sabu came in and put Spike through a table. The other Dudleys came in like they were going to save Spike, but instead turned on him as well until Taz, the Eliminators, and Chris Condito came in to chase them away, which turned into an 8-man main event, although I'm not sure Condito actually ever tagged into that match. Sandman and Balls Mahoney did the same gimmick with the $40 and the beer, but since Mahoney is being turned babyface, and even being groomed for a push, which is really scary considering how pathetic his matches have been, Sandman, to show he's accepting him, gave him half the beer. Revere was said to have been the meanest and most unappreciative crowd in the history of the promotion. When Raven tried to work with Spike Dudley doing wrestling, the crowd first died, then began chanting things like refund and was vicious at them. Louis Spicolli did his click NWO hand signals again, and Tommy Dreamer again did the run-in and broke his hand. Spicolli talked about his friends Kevin and Scott but said that unlike others in the promotion, he isn't going anywhere. Rick Rude was at the show taunting Shane Douglas. Douglas ended up DQ'd against Stevie Richards. Rude hit Condito, who was helping Douglas, with a chair a few times. Douglas had Richards beaten with a belly-to-belly when Raven ran in and DDT'd Richards for the DQ. Douglas got mad at Raven since the interference cost him a match he was about to win. They did a three-way dance with eliminators keeping the tag belts, beating Big Dick and Devon Dudley and Sabu and Van Dam. Killer Kowalski got involved in the finish, first hitting Bubba with his crutch when Bubba tried to interfere, and then putting the stomach claw on Joel Gertner when Gertner tried to announce the Dudleys as the winners by points. They'll be back in the area on June 20th in Waltham and June 21st in Revere and a June 22nd date somewhere in New Hampshire. There is talk of the August 17th pay-per-view coming from Lowell, Massachusetts. The Gangsters didn't work this weekend as Heyman won't book them in Massachusetts, both because of the possibility of a legal problem since the Eric Kulas case hasn't been resolved, and because it's something of a punishment on New Jack for getting the company in so much trouble. In Revere, where the only blood on the show was Sandman's from smashing his own head into the beer can, by the end of the night there were chants of "We want New Jack" from the bloodthirsty mob. There are plenty of rumors flying that the Gangsters are headed to WCW, although at this point they haven't given notice to ECW and nobody in WCW is talking about it either. The situation with Bill Alfonso in the WCW Nitro taping in Philadelphia is that Alfonso was not at Nitro, but talked with several WCW wrestlers at the hotel after the show, and others heard and misinterpreted that as him being at the show. The only reason that's an important distinction is that Paul Heyman said he'd fire anyone immediately who attended the WCW show. Van Dam Schkowski, not Jean-Claude, is in a martial arts film called Superfights that hits the video stores next month. It was said to make No Holds Barred look like Braveheart in comparison. Sabu is expected to be married soon. WCW. Nitro on April 28 in Norfolk, Virginia drew a sellout 9,467, 8,761 paying $138,305 for the first of a series of one-hour shows because of the NBA playoffs. They opened the show airing clips of the December 27, 1993 match in Charlotte where Ric Flair beat Vader for the WCW title, including the final pin. Obviously this was for dual reasons, getting over Flair having beaten big guys before with Kevin Nash on the opposite side, and also to stick it to Vader in a week where he's gotten tight in a lot of publicity, and don't think for a second there isn't a lot of deep-seated animosity among many in WCW and Eric Bischoff in particular towards Vader. Flair and Piper came out to challenge the NWO to a match later in the show. Flair got an incredible pop. Dean Malenko beat Prince Iaukea to keep the U.S. title with the Cloverleaf in 3:02. There was a fight in the crowd and Iaukea was momentarily distracted from the match, which was noticeable on live television. Malenko did a good job carrying Iaukea to a good short match. On the next pay-per-view, they've switched the U.S. title bout from Malenko vs. Iaukea to Malenko vs. Jeff Jarrett and also made the Chris Benoit vs. Meng match into a death match. 6 beat Juventud Guerrera in 4:37 with the Buzzkiller in a really good cruiserweight title match. Guerrera slipped up twice but recovered quickly. Good crowd heat, particularly for Guerrera doing a springboard somersault dropkick and a Rana into a Hurricane Rana, both for near falls. They did an NWO interview which was short and they really didn't say much except claim that they drew the sellout house. Chris Benoit beat Steven Regal via DQ in 2:12 when Kevin Sullivan interfered. After the match, Meng put the claw on Benoit and refused to break it. Regal tried to help Benoit but wasn't successful. The word now is that Sullivan's career time limit is about to run out, perhaps as early as June. If you're wondering why Meng is being pushed as this killer singles wrestler, and then on the Saturday TBS show did a quickie submission job to Lex Luger, it's because the TBS match was taped on April 16th and between April 16th and April 21st they decided to give Meng the new push and is simply forgotten by all that he had just been taped days earlier during a squash job on television. Luger and Giant beat French Canadians in 3:01 when Giant choke slammed Jacques. Then in Angle Snafu number 367, Steve McMichael wrestled Barbarian. Before the match started, they showed the angle where Reggie White took the briefcase and said he wasn't going to give it back unless McMichael takes it from him in a pay-per-view match. McMichael vs. Barbarian was pretty bad, although it could have been a lot worse. The finish, you ask? McMichael clocked Barbarian with the briefcase behind the ref's back for the pin in 3:05. Hey, doesn't Reggie have the darn thing? Funniest part is that the finished plan for McMichael vs. Reggie at the pay-per-view was supposed to be McMichael introducing a second briefcase and using it for the pin, since Reggie had the original. And poor Bobby Heenan. First he said that if McMichael hit Barbarian with it that it wouldn't hurt. You know, those big island guys and their hard heads. Then Barbarian sells it like he's shot and Heenan looks like a fool. Then Heenan again tries to save the day by saying that McMichael got the new briefcase, since he actually must have paid enough attention to angles that he knew Reggie was supposed to have the original one, except that this one had the same dents as the other one. Flair and Piper came out for their challenge match. Flair wasn't exactly dressed in the kind of clothes one would associate getting into a fight with. Flair then uttered the line of the night, saying that he's held more world titles than Six has had pieces of ass in his entire life. Well, I thought it was funny, but apparently if I had been working in WCW, I'd have been in the distinct minority, as the viewpoint was very negative, to the point where there was a lot of talk about suspending Flair or not letting him do live interviews. By the next day, since there wasn't much of a reaction from viewers, it'll probably die down. I still can't figure out what was so bad about the line, considering that last week's Six was talking about Flair having no sack. Anyway, they challenged the guys to come out. They did. Flair tackled Six in the aisle and gave Hall and Nash low blows. Then put the figure 4 on Six. Hall and Nash began stomping him and they did a 3-on-1. Flair should have read all the letters about Gracie Jiu-Jitsu by frustrated karate guys in the karate mags about how you can't go to the ground in a fight against multiple attackers. Anyway, Piper just stood there while this was all going on as Flair screamed for him to help. Finally, just as the show went off the air, Piper ran down and began whipping Nash with his belt. The original plan was for Piper to only hesitate momentarily before saving Flair, but since the brawl started several minutes early, it was screwed up because Piper was supposed to start getting the blows in right as the show went off. It was supposed to be the beginning of a Piper turn on Flair, but nobody was supposed to figure it out. But now even the densest Mark can see it coming, so I guess that means maybe they'll change it. The plan was for Piper and Flair to team in May and June, shoot the angle in June, and wrestle each other in July. As for the Charlotte match, believe it or not, there is a chance it'll be Flair that does the job. Either he or Kevin Green, with Six a third possibility and like no chance for Hall, Nash or Piper. Originally it was supposed to be Six, but you know how these things go. Overall it was a good 1-hour television show. They also had in non-TV matches, Conan and Hugh Morris over Renegade and Joe Gomez when Renegade walked out on Gomez, Bobby Eaton beat Max, Alex Wright beat Billy Kidman. Steiners beat High Voltage and Marcus Bagwell and Scott Norton beat Public Enemy. No Monday ratings are available at press time. Only ratings we have are for the Saturday shows with main event at 1.1 and Saturday night at 1.9. For comparison purposes, during this NBA playoff period last year where Nitro was moved to 7 p.m. and Raw went unopposed, last year Raw averaged a 3.7 during that period and Nitro a 2.2. I presume it'll be closer this year, but Raw should still win handily due to the stronger time slot, and if Raw wins by a point or more every week, it really means nothing because it won by 1.5 every week last year, and as soon as things went back to normal, WCW began winning handily. Rey Mysterio Jr. is tentatively planning on getting reconstructive surgery on his knee after all, but holding off the operation until the end of June. He'll be out of action for several months after that point. Lizmark Jr. and Black Warrior are scheduled to debut at the Universal Studio tapings in Orlando, Florida from May 1st to May 8th. They are billing the McMichael vs. White match as the first time Super Bowl champion football players have been on opposite sides of a match. Technically that is correct in regard to singles matches, but the WWF at WrestleMania 2 in Chicago did have William Perry, Bears, Jim Covert, Bears, Ernie Holmes, Steelers, and Harvey Martin, Cowboys, as opponents in a battle royal. Perhaps Russ Francis as well, but I'm not certain if Francis was on a Super Bowl winning team with the 49ers, but it seems to be that he was. Apparently everyone was impressed with Yuji Nagata's debut. Roddy Piper wanted to do a live debate on television with Kevin Nash, but was wisely talked out of it. There is a good chance that the NWO Great Muta turn will take place at Slamboree. At this point, even though it appears they are shooting, both sides pretty much know ahead of time what is going to be said in the interviews building up the six-man. It's one of those deals where it started off with guys out of control, and some would say they still are, but now they're trying to use it for business. The only concession is that Hall, Nash and Six are not supposed to call Flair and Piper old. The Hogan-Luger title match is scheduled for the June 9th Boston Nitro, which apparently, since it's Sullivan's hometown and will be the biggest gate in company history, is supposed to be a pay-per-view caliber show. Savage vs. Page is tentative to headline the Great American Bash pay-per-view on June 15th in Moline, Illinois. The July 13th Daytona Beach Bash at the Beach pay-per-view is tentatively to be headlined by Luger and Giant vs. Hogan and Rodman. Although the match will blow unless there's a lot of distractions thrown in, it's smart to use Giant in the match with Rodman because it'll make tons of photos around the country, and having someone that large in the photos next to Rodman will mean more in getting the Giant over than having him or a good worker performing a good match with Rodman. Only house show of the week was April 27th in Fayetteville, North Carolina, which drew a sellout 4,012 fans and $54,000. Detroit will be the site of an interesting live show war as Raw will be taped June 23rd at Cobo Arena and Nitro will be taped on August 4th at the Palace in Auburn Hills. Merchandise continues to do phenomenal business. Norfolk was $48,000, which is actually disappointing by the standards in some cities of $7 to $10 per head. Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, with the more heel-oriented crowds, did 38% and 43% NWO merchandise respectively. Philadelphia set the company all-time merchandise record at $143,352. The Sting t-shirt is the top seller everywhere, followed by NWO and the New Page t-shirts. In most cities right now, the split is about 69 to 31 WCW over NWO when it comes to merchandise. Phil Mushnick of the New York Post and TV Guide, who has been regularly ripping pro wrestling of late, ripped Reggie White for his participation with WCW. Mushnick's website has gotten a lot of complaints from wrestling fans for his attitude, enough to where he wrote back explaining why he felt the way he did about wrestling, and in some very valid points doing so. WWF. Weekend house show business was huge as April 25th in St. Louis at Kiel Center drew $8,335 and $139,723. April 26th in Kansas City drew $9,750 and $164,182. The largest gate ever for pro wrestling in Kansas City and one of the 2 or 3 largest crowds ever. And April 27th in Sioux City, Iowa drew $2,687 and $47,777. Due to injuries, lots of card changes. The main event that drew the gates was Undertaker defending against Bret Hart, which confirms what everyone really already knows about the success of the Hart heel turn. It wound up with Undertaker pinning Davey Boy Smith on top all 3 nights. Raw on April 28th in Omaha, Nebraska drew a sellout 6,617, paying $88,124. The show was very good since almost everything in the Bret Hart vs. Austin angle is great. Lack of depth in the promotion is still apparent, as most of the rest of the show was dead. Fortunately, they put Hart and Austin out there every 5 minutes or so it seemed. It started with Brian Pillman doing a sacrilegious interview praying to our savior Bret Hart. Steve Austin then appeared on the screen and said he was going to beat Pillman up, but Owen Hart and Smith came out and Austin went into the crowd to avoid the 3-on-1. Flash Funk pinned Rockabilly in 423 with a Hurricane Rana, but after the match Rockabilly hit Funk with the guitar and left him laying. Not good. Bret Hart arrived in a wheelchair and did an anti-American interview, which was his weakest TV interview since the turn. Legion of Doom beat Doug Furnas and Phil LaFawn in 346 when Animal pinned Furnas after a clothesline off the top by Huck, although Furnas wasn't the legal man. Match was a style clash. Actually, Road Warriors against almost anyone nowadays is a style clash. Furnas and LaFawn desperately need a manager. They are so not over it's like they're 6 feet under. For the first time in history, they're actually doing a gimmick about that, as Furnas and LaFawn's gimmick as explained by Vince McMahon and Jim Ross is basically that they aren't over. McMahon explained that American fans aren't used to Furnas and LaFawn's European style. So that's what it is. They did an interview challenging LOD after the match. A dead segment. Owen Hart pinned Rocky Maivia with a Japanese rolling crotch hold in 8:27 of another dead match. 1 1/4 stars. Austin did an interview and Bret was on the screen. They aired a Ken Shamrock video, which was the best thing they've done with him to date. Vader destroyed Jesse Jam in 1:34. After the match they did the angle where Vader was about to rough up Jim Ross when Shamrock gave him a belly-to-belly. This segment was good. Goldust beat Hunter Hearst Helmsley via count out in 7:43. Goldust told Marlena not to come to ringside during the match, but she did a few minutes into it and threw powder in Chyna's eyes. Chyna then lifted up Helmsley into a neck-hanging 3 and Hunter was counted out. Goldust worked his ass off in this match, but this feud just doesn't get over with Goldust as a face. They announced that just as Ellen is coming out of the closet, that Goldust will with an interview next week, so they'll acknowledge him next week as Dustin Rhodes. Talk about being in Dusty Rhodes' shadow or whatever explanation they're coming up with. 1 1/4 stars. Undertaker beat Bulldog via DQ in 4:07 when Owen interfered. Most of the match took place during commercial break, Austin made the save and he and Undertaker cleaned house. Austin then turned on Undertaker and hit the Stone Cold Stunner. Undertaker sat up and grabbed Austin by the throat and choke slammed him. Austin finally recovered and went after Bret in the wheelchair but was attacked by Jim Neidhart. The world was waiting with bated breath for his return, and Bret hit Austin with his crutch, breaking the crutch, and knocking Austin off the stage where Austin did a stretcher job as the show went off the air. Nothing notable on Shotgun, and the only major dark match saw Undertaker beat Vader in 2 minutes. Sid wasn't there again this week. He had an MRI done on his back on April 28. Over the weekend on TV they had announced he would be at Raw to do an interview, but by Sunday it was known he wasn't going to be there. Notes from the Shotgun tapings at the April 21 Binghamton, New York tapings. LOD beat Godwins in the match where Henry Godwin suffered the neck injury, which is actually a fractured 7th cervical vertebrae, and he'll be out of action for some time. It was on the finish where Godwin tried to take the flip bump off the LOD finisher, but ended up falling straight down and landing on his head. Maivia beat Tony DeVito, Funk beat someone and Crush and Savio Vega and D. Lo Brown subbing for Farouk, who hasn't recovered fully yet, beat Aldo Montoya and Freddie Joe Floyd and Steve Corino. The only dark match saw LOD beat Hart and Smith in a tag title bout via DQ. Livewire on April 26 did a 1.4 rating. Spanish language announcer Hugo Savinovich, 38, was fired after being arrested at his apartment in Stamford, Connecticut on charges of possession of narcotics, child neglect and possession of drug paraphernalia on April 24. Stamford police arrested Savinovich and 2 companions when they investigated in his apartment and found malnourished 5- and 6-year-old children in an apartment lined with cockroaches and crack cocaine vials. All 3 adults were held on $20,000 bond. When the WWF was asked to comment, they said that Savinovich no longer worked for the company. Sultan may have suffered his rib injury originally while on tour in South Africa before it was aggravated by Ahmed Johnson's 2x4 shot to the rib on April 21. Yokozuna was contacted about coming back with all the injuries, but he's on blood-thinning medication, so if he were to suffer an accidental cut, the blood wouldn't clot and it could be really disastrous. No word on when he'll get clearance to return. Mankind's contract is about to expire and he hasn't signed a renewal. Announced for May 30 at the San Jose Arena is Undertaker and Sid and Austin vs. Bret, who isn't expected back by then, and Owen and Smith, Vader and Mankind vs. LOD, Ahmed Johnson vs. Farouk with Shamrock as referee, and Helmsley vs. Goldust. Judging from those shows and current feuds, I suspect, and this is all supposition at this point, the mixed tag with Marlena and Chyna involved will take place at King of the Ring, and that Undertaker-Austin will wind up with the Hart Foundation attacking Austin and Undertaker saving. Either they'll cost Austin the match, or they'll take the easy way out and attack both guys and it'll be a no decision. Possibly Goldust and Marlena will get involved in the finish of Funk vs. Helmsley when Chyna goes after the Funkettes. Curtis Hughes was backstage at the Raw taping, so I guess his health has improved and he may be on the way back. Raw tapings in June are June 2nd in Huntington, West Virginia, June 9th in Hartford, Connecticut, head-to-head with Nitro in Boston the same night, June 16th in Lake Placid, New York, June 23rd in Detroit at Cobo, and June 30th in Des Moines, Iowa. Other major house show dates for June are June 13th in Montreal, June 14th in Toronto at Skydome, June 20th at Philadelphia Core State Center, June 21st at Nassau Coliseum, June 28th at the Anaheim Pond, head-to-head with WCW at the Forum, and June 29th in Denver. Montreal and Toronto will be headlined by Undertaker vs. Bret with Shamrock ref, Smith vs. Michaels for the European title, Owen vs. Austin for IC title, Johnson vs. Farouk, LOD vs. Vader and Mankind, Sid vs. Helmsley, Pillman vs. Maivia, Goldust vs. Rockabilly, Godwins vs. Blackjacks, and Headbangers vs. Furnace and La Fawn. Philadelphia and Nassau Coliseum will have Undertaker and Austin vs. Bret and Pillman, Smith vs. Michaels for European title, Owen vs. Sid for IC title, and LOD vs. Farouk and Crush. Anaheim will have a triangle match for the title with Undertaker, Bret, and Michaels, Austin vs. Pillman, Smith vs. Sid for European title, Owen vs. Goldust for IC title, LOD vs. Farouk and Crush, Shamrock vs. Vader in a no-holds-barred, Maivia vs. Helmsley, Papa, new character who may be Charles Papa Shango Wright, vs. Mankind, and a lingerie battle royal with Sunny, Sable, Marlena, and Chyna. About 10 years ago in Mid-South they did the lingerie battle royal gimmick with Missy Hyatt, Sunshine, Dark Journey, and Nicola Babydoll Roberts, and they were atrocious and didn't get over live. Denver will have the same show as Anaheim except without the women. It'll probably work better nowadays, but they had better keep it short or it'll be so atrocious it isn't funny. Expect all those lineups to change before the shows take place, because in the current environment, All plans are constantly changing. The reader's pages. Bret Hart. Bret Hart is becoming falling down Bob Backlund right before our eyes. I loved his speech on the March 17th Raw. I also caught Hart interviewed by Chet Kopic on the March 20th New Sports Talk Show. He was very honest commenting on Shawn Michaels, Hulk Hogan, Goldust, Steve Austin, Vince McMahon and Dave Meltzer. Hart also talked about how American wrestling is changing where a face can be booed and a heel can be cheered. He raised questions about the timing and severity of Michaels' injury. It was a very enjoyable interview. Even though the Dudleys beat the Eliminators, I have a hard time accepting them as legitimate wrestlers. I still view them as job guys. Let me be another person to give Eric Bischoff credit. He went over to Japan, saw what was drawing money there, and brought the idea back to the United States. The result was the NWO. I'm not a big fan of his, but you have to give him major kudos for turning WCW around. I didn't think it was possible. James Zordani. Watseka, Illinois. ECW. I attended the ECW show in Trenton on March 8th. The flyer said the doors opened at 6 p.m. Two friends and I arrived at 7:10 for an 8 p.m. show. Finally, at 8:30, we got into the building. There were hundreds of people outside in about 35-degree weather. It was an old SIO hall with a fire escape and door on the second floor which we were right below. During the time we were out there, New Jack, Shane Douglas, Francine, Sonny, Chris Condito and even Paul E. stood out there, so Paul knew how many people were outside and started the show at 8 p.m. anyway. There were a lot of very hostile people outside, saying they couldn't believe this company got national TV exposure for this unorganized crap. It was my first time seeing ECW live, but I've heard about similar problems before. Once we got inside, we heard from a woman from the SIO hall that there were going to be a lot of unhappy people because they oversold the building, so people that had tickets weren't getting refunds when they finally got in. When we got in, there was nobody there to help us find our seats and the place was a zoo. We found out Taz had already wrestled, so we didn't get to see him. The best match was Sabu versus Condito. The crowd was really into the pure violence, but when they tried to wrestle, the crowd couldn't have cared less. This was really evident during the second best match on the card, Little Guido versus Chris Chetti. They did a lot of good spots, but the people didn't care and booed them out of the place. After the match, Guido was really mad and people were throwing cans at him. He threw some of them back at the fans. Well, once that happened, all hell broke loose. Cans came at him from everywhere. People even threw chairs at him. They got him out of there as fast as they could, but during all this, a fan was hit with something, probably a can, and was bleeding pretty good. They stopped the show for about 10 minutes and Paul E. came out and gave him a t-shirt. The fans chanted at the fan that he was hardcore. I think I'll go back because after seeing WWF, it was nice to be that close to the action, which, by the way, gave me first-hand proof of how bad Brian Lee really is. On the Howard Stern show on March 10th, Dennis Rodman and Hulk Hogan were on. Stern cared about Rodman but couldn't care less about Hogan. Howard said since they were there he'd let Hogan have a plug and asked him where the March 16th pay-per-view show was. Hogan didn't know, but he said that wherever it was, it would be a great show because Dennis would be there. Also, for what this is worth, I live about 5 minutes from the hair place Tito Santana opened in Roxbury, New Jersey. It's called Santana's, and with every haircut, you get a free autograph. Hank Fadderesso. Flanders, New Jersey. Questions. 1. Is it true that if you hit a Samoan in the head it doesn't hurt and only makes them mad? 2. Why are wrestlers from parts unknown often also announced as having weight unknown? Are there no scales there? 3. Do masked wrestlers have their masks on in their driver's license photos? They wear them in the shower according to Gorilla Monsoon. 4. If a wrestler holds onto a submission hold after the end of the match, why does the referee try to break it by counting? 5. After all the good work he's done for so many years, why hasn't Sergeant Slaughter been promoted? 6. Do you have to pay an import tax on a foreign object? 7. Why do they call it a turnbuckle when it doesn't turn? 8. Why can you have a Texas death match outside of Texas? What if nobody dies? 9. Why is Steve Austin a babyface? 10. Is an Indian strap match now called a Native American strap match? 11. Let's see if I get this straight. Hanging a photo of someone with their breast accidentally exposed is sexual harassment, but letting Howard Stern finger paint your tits isn't. 12. Is there anyone in wrestling, besides Pat Patterson, who Missy Hyatt hasn't been linked to? 13. The South African Truth Commission in wrestling. Isn't that an oxymoron? 14. What do they do with the metal pieces that are missing from Public Enemy's tables? Do they recycle? 15. Who is chunkier, Nancy, Sherry, or Dusty? Russ Kress. Union, New Jersey. Response from Dave Meltzer. 1. From years of growing up watching Samoans wrestle, that somehow has always seemed to be the case. I'm still trying to figure out why it doesn't work that way in boxing. 2. I'm not sure if they have any scales there. The few times I've been to parts unknown, the last thing I was concerned with was how much I weighed. 3. No. When I was a kid, that was actually how we'd find out the identity of the masked guys, when this was really a kayfabe business. You become friends with the groupies, aka rats, but I like using the politically correct term since it's the 90s, and they get the identities for you. In those days, when the masked guys slept with the groupies, they'd never remove their masks because it was a kayfabe business. Really? This is all true, even though a lot of you are going to be skeptical and think I'm joking. But what they didn't know is that after showering together, the groupies would get out first, open up their wallet, take a quick look at their license, and call me up the next morning to find out if the real name rang a bell, and I'd let them know what other wrestling names the guy had used. Oh, and the guys in those days really did wear their masks in the shower, at least when they were with women. So those driver's licenses were the best way to get their identities. 4. Because that's what they teach you in referee school. 5. They've actually watched tapes of his matches. 6. Usually no, but if you try and carry them on your person and go through the metal detectors on the airplane, you're going to be asked a lot of questions. 7. Actually the connective part does turn. 8. It supposedly originated in Texas. Besides, how can you have a suicide squeeze in baseball if you blow it and the guy doesn't kill himself? Or how come you can have a sudden death period in football and everyone lives through it? Isn't that false advertising? Boy, I wish every sport had a Mexican wrestling commission. 9. Because people cheer him. 10. I don't know, but midgets are now called minis. I wonder if Russian chain matches have been broken up into several different republics. 11. There's a huge difference. Whatever someone does by their own decision, as long as it's legal, is not sexual harassment. But if someone hangs up a photo that you didn't want taken of your exposed breast in the office that you work in, it is wrong, no matter if you'd consent at another time under different circumstances to have such a photo taken. 12. Me, and also Mark Madden. There may be 1 or 2 others, but that's just a rumor. 13. No more than the AWA Brain Trust. 14. They save them for future artificial limbs. 15. Dusty. But if I had to find out by having them all sit on me, I'd probably die 3 very different kinds of deaths. WWF commentary. The commentary during the Space Cadets vs. Maniaco and Mosco and Hysteria and Abismo Negro match on the challenge version was without a doubt the best called Lucha Libre match I've ever heard in my life, and one of the best called pro wrestling matches of any kind. Kevin Kelly and Jim Cornette really rolled up their sleeves for this one. They knew who the workers were, what their histories were, what their holds were called, and they called the match with such care, respecting the talents of the wrestlers and how hard they were working. By the end of the match, for the first time in years, I was really proud to be a wrestling fan. If every so-called announcer in the business would get a copy of a tape of that match and study it, then maybe they could save themselves the embarrassment of coming across like a complete doofus on a weekly basis. I realize that Cornette is about to resume his managerial career, aligning himself with a 90s version of the Midnight Express in Furnace and La Fawn, but he would be a far greater asset to the WWF or any company as an unbiased babyface straight man color commentator. With the face/heel dichotomy becoming more and more passé, I found that Cornette's demeanor in the lucha match came across 10 times better than if he was doing the Jerry Lawler basic heel shtick. I think the best thing right now for wrestling would be to have more bland colorless announcers with no ego, sacrificing getting over their own personalities for the sake of serving the product. In other words, say goodbye to Dusty, Heenan, and Lawler. Regarding Bill Miller, you did an excellent job as always. It should be pointed out that his brother Dan was one of the early holders of the Mid-Atlantic title when it was called the Eastern Heavyweight title. Before going to Florida in 1982, he worked this area as a local promoter and ran spot shows for Jim Crockett Promotions from the late 70s through early 80s during a period that the company ran as many as 3, and sometimes even 4 house shows per night. It was during this period that Bill Eadie put on the mask as the superstar and became that era's version of Bill Miller, vowing to unmask if anyone could beat him. As best I can recall, Eadie's stints in JCP and Georgia were the last great runs for a masked heel in the United States. That gimmick couldn't work today because some smartass would hold up a sign with Miller's name on it. Richard Sullivan. Forest City, North Carolina. WCW. Thanks for translating those interviews. Even working for WCW, most of us can't figure out what is being said or done. Name withheld for